Good evening. Good to see everybody again tonight. Glad that you're able to make it back. As Mike mentioned, we did have a great crowd this morning. We do have a good crowd again tonight. We're thankful that you're here. I also appreciate him mentioning the lectureship and Ladies' Day coming up. I actually was going to say something about that only because he had mentioned that now is a good time to go ahead and start getting word out. And in conjunction with that, we should have our advertisements in. Tracked it the other day and it said Tuesday, but they'll at least be here by Wednesday anyway. So when you come in Wednesday night, there should be some stacks of postcards back on the back table. One will be for the lectureship, and then like we did last year, there is a separate one just for Ladies' Day too. The Ladies' Day information is on the lectureship postcard, but we also did one just for the Ladies' Day. So there'll be both of those back there. By all means, please pick up as many as you can use and pass them out. I think I ordered plenty, but if we run out, I will be more than happy to order more. And I think we've got a great lineup this year. The schedule is on the website already. I know we haven't been able to post it, but if you want to get on the website, you can click on the banner that scrolls. There's one for the lectureship. If you click on that banner, then it'll bring up a PDF version of the schedule. And you can look and see who all is going to be speaking and what the subjects are going to be. And I think we've got a good lineup and some good topics that, as he said, are going to take some principles out of Nehemiah and the rebuilding of the wall and the rebuilding of the nation and apply them to how we can rise up and build up the local congregation. And how we can strengthen our hands together to accomplish God's work here. So keep that in mind, be praying about it, be inviting others, and we're looking forward to having a good crowd that weekend. We've got a busy few months coming up. We've got the lectureship and Ladies' Day in April. May we'll be having our Friend and Family Day like we normally do, and we'll have postcards in Tuesday for that too. And then June is Bible School. Throughout June and July is Summer Youth Series and Camp. August, I don't know if we necessarily have anything on a congregational basis in August, but then we'll have our meeting in September. So we've got a lot crammed into the next few months, which is good. But let's all set our minds toward the work, be inviting people, be praying about it. Hope that these all provide some great opportunities for this congregation to reach out and to impact some folks in this community. This morning we continued our thoughts that we've had ongoing throughout the month of March in terms of how and why the church matters. And we talked about this morning how really up to today we talked about this theme in terms of how the concept of the church in terms primarily of organized religion should matter to us because it does matter to God. At least organized religion when it has been organized by God. And that's not something that we should just give in to abandoning in life like many in our world are trying to influence most of us to do. Religion has been given to us by God. New Testament Christianity has been organized by God. And because of that, it should always play a significant role in our lives. This morning, though, we talked about how we wanted to spend today taking it out of that generic discussion from just the organized religion perspective and bring it down on a more personal level to the local congregation of which we are a part, whether it be here at Phillip Street or if you're visiting with us from wherever you're from. The local congregation matters. And we've been talking about today, this morning, how the local congregation matters in terms of what the local congregation should be able to expect out of me and what it should be able to expect out of you as members of that congregation. We do not exist in this life solely to be served or solely to have our needs met. In other words, we should not expect the church to be at our beck and call to fill every need and every want that we might have in life. We as members of that church, as parts of that body, have responsibilities toward the church. But tonight we did want to flip that conversation and talk about the fact that we as members of the church should be able to expect some things out of the church. That there are needs in our lives that need to be met and can only be met, at least some of these needs can only be met by the local congregation, by the church as organized and as designed by God. You know, being a Christian is an investment. Or at least we should look at it as being an investment in our lives. We have to be invested in Christianity, right? And if we look at Christianity as being an investment, we can look at it as being an investment in different ways. Number one, it's an investment as pertaining to our own souls. We're investing ourselves in Christianity if we are New Testament Christians. And as investing ourselves in Christianity, that means we are dedicating ourselves to Christianity to ensure that it's able to grow and that it's able to be stable and that it's able to accomplish its purpose. If you as a Christian are invested in Christianity, then there's a good possibility that at the same time you have invested your family in Christianity. We have entire families in this congregation who come together, who are able and privileged to come together as members of this congregation, and you invest yourselves collectively in this congregation. But you know, at the same time, Christianity is an investment with regard to whatever local congregation of which we may be a part. Think about it this way. In many respects, the local church of which we are members can, in some respects, make or break our lives of faith. It can make or break our relationship with God, and it can also make or break the amount of effort that we put into Christianity. Now, that might sound odd to you, to hear me say that the mere local congregation of which we're a part can contribute to whether we make it as Christians or whether we don't. But before you judge what I just said, I want you to look at some examples in the Bible of congregations that no doubt because of their identity, because of how they were known in the first century world among God's people, obviously were either influential in helping those members of that congregation be Christians or discouraged the members among them from being faithful Christians. Think about, for instance, the church at Corinth. Of all that we know about the church in Corinth, it was not necessarily a church that we would like to pattern ourselves after, would we? From the very first chapter, Paul addressed so many different problems that existed in that congregation, from the general reality of division that existed among them to the fact that they as a group of people simply were not dedicated enough to righteousness and purity among them to deal with sin when it was present within them as a body. To chapter 6, the dysfunction of taking one another to court and suing one another in the public eye over matters. To the resurrection, to meat that was offered to idols, to their bickering over the spiritual gifts. You take a good, long, hard look at the church at Corinth and you tell me that was a congregation that was conducive to Christians being Christians. I'm not saying you couldn't be a member of the church at Corinth and not go to heaven, but they were going to make it really, really hard, weren't they? You think also about the church in Galatia and the troubles that they faced doctrinally, and the fact that they were not grounded in the truth enough to withstand the attacks that they had to endure with regard to the purity of the gospel that Paul had previously taught among them, Galatians chapter 2. There was a sense of immaturity, there was a sense of weakness among those brethren that might have been natural because of their spiritual age, but nonetheless, they were immature enough that they weren't able to withstand error when it came among them, and so they faced a number of problems. You think about the churches of Asia Minor, Revelation chapters 2 and 3, and how each of them, though some seemingly worse than others, each of them had their own unique problems that would have been a potential detriment to the faith of every single member of those congregations if they weren't strong enough to be able to abide in spite of them. Now, you look at all of those examples of congregations that, because of whatever reason, whether it be immaturity or whether it be a weakened understanding of Scripture, or whether it just be a lack of a backbone, or whatever it might be, you look at all of those examples of congregations in the New Testament that the inspired writers addressed because of the problems that existed among them, and see how it just was not the case in those environments. Do you see environments that were conducive to both faithfulness individually or growth as a congregation? And compare those congregations to others that are addressed in the New Testament that were just the opposite. I think about congregations like the church at Philippi, or the church at Ephesus, or the church at Colossae, that while they were not perfect, from what Paul wrote to them and wrote about them, seemed to be much healthier church environments than those we had mentioned before, that just naturally would have made being a Christian in those environments a little bit easier. Comparing those different options that existed in the first century, do you think there was any significance to which congregation a Christian in the first century might have found themselves to be members of? Do you think there were any congregations like Philippi or Ephesus or Colossae that it was just a little bit easier to be a Christian in than others, like Corinth or Galatia or those churches of Asia in Revelation chapters 2 and 3? A lot of the issues surrounding what we should expect out of the local church, I'm afraid, has to do with what those expectations are. And what I mean by that is, I've heard people, when this subject is addressed with regard to what we as Christians should be able to expect out of the local congregation, I've heard that simple discussion be attacked as being selfish. That we as Christians shouldn't expect anything out of the local congregation, that we're here to serve, and we're here to serve, and we're here to serve, and we shouldn't expect anything in return. And folks, that's just simply not true. Tonight I want us to take a trip, just like we did this morning, through some of those churches of the first century that we read about in the New Testament, and put all opinion to the side, and see just as much as there were expectations that the church did have of its members in the first century, that there were expectations in the first century that Christians were able to have toward that local church. In the fact that we do have needs as Christians that need to be filled. Yes, we are here to serve. I'm not doubting that. I'm not denying it. But in some respects, we also need to be served, so that we are able to maintain our faith, so that we are able to have our burdens carried by others in a respect, and so that we receive the encouragement that we need to go on each day serving as well. And so we had 4 this morning. I want to focus our attention primarily on 4 tonight. Number 1. Well, there's the clicker over there. Number 1. What should I be able to expect out of the local congregation? Number 1, I need to be able to, as a member of the church, be able to expect the local church of which I'm a member to be a place where I can be fed, You remember in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, that Peter began that chapter by saying, putting away therefore all wickedness, and all guile, and all hypocrisy, and envies, and all evil speakings, as newborn babes, long for the spiritual milk, which is without guile, that ye may grow thereby. That passage is not unfamiliar to you. We talk about it a lot, and rightfully so. But you know, typically when we talk about 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, we talk about it in terms of how we, to be fed, should tend to ourselves, that we need to be active in feeding ourselves. And how that feeding has to come through proper study and meditation in the Scriptures, like you see in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 15. And that is exactly right. If we are going to have a good, steady diet of spiritual nutrition, we do need to be active in pursuing that knowledge. I need to be active, and you need to be active every single day in sitting down with this book and actually reading it and studying it and digesting it ourselves. But you know, I fear that if we rely on that mentality in 1 Peter 2, 1 and 2 exclusively, that we miss a little bit of the picture that Peter's trying to paint there. Now, look again at how he words it. As newborn babes, long for the spiritual milk that is without guile, that ye may grow thereby. Now, I have a newborn babe in my house right now, and she is yet to be able to feed herself. I imagine it'll be a little bit more convenient one day when she does, but right now it's not just that she doesn't, it's that she can't. She doesn't have the capability to feed herself. And you know, I've never met a newborn babe that could, have you? There's kind of a natural understanding. And of course, he's talking about his newborn babes. He's talking about the newborn Christian, the immature Christian, one who isn't grounded enough in the faith to be able to go on feeding themselves regularly and properly. But you know, at the same time, there's still the need present in all of our lives to be fed. To actually have someone offer this nutrition to us. Now, yes, it should be the case that we're seeking it on our own at other times, but that doesn't take away from the fact that I need to be fed at times. I can tell you from personal experience, sometimes we take that for granted. Until you're in a position to where you are typically the one doing the feeding and very rarely are being fed, and then you come to a greater appreciation of the fact that you need to be fed, that sometimes sitting down and reading the Bible on your own and studying it just isn't enough. You need those opportunities where you can actually sit and listen to someone else teach you. And I love those opportunities that I have. Some people might think I'm nuts for going to lectureships and workshops, but when you're in a position of where you're the one who's primarily doing the feeding, the opportunity to be fed takes on a whole different role in your life. It doesn't matter how much we sit down and how much we study on our own, still the time comes in each of our lives when we need to be fed. And how is that need going to be filled in our lives? The need to be fed, not just the need to go out and partake on our own, but the need to be fed. The New Testament talks about the fact that is a responsibility that resides within the local congregation, does it not? And the way the New Testament addresses it is in Acts 20 and verse 28. When you remember that Paul was speaking to the elders of the church at Ephesus, and he commended them to God and to the word of His grace, which is able to build them up, to give them inheritance among all them which are sanctified. But in verse 28, you remember that he told them they had the responsibility within themselves as elders of that congregation to feed the flock over which the Holy Spirit had made them overseers. Feeding the flock A responsibility that, yes, falls upon the shoulders of an eldership, but is administered unto us as Christians through the avenue of the local congregation. But if I'm not receiving the spiritual nutrition that I need, that congregation is not living up to its divinely appointed responsibility, is it? I think the New Testament is telling us in some respects that if I'm a member of a local church, then I have the right to expect that when I am among those brethren, when I am within that congregation, that congregation is a congregation where I am, number one, being fed. And if I'm not being fed properly, then that congregation's not doing its job. And something needs to happen. Now, what that something is, that's a whole nother conversation. But something needs to happen. Number two, not only do I, as a member of the local church, have a right to expect that local church be a place where I'm being fed and being fed properly, but in conjunction to that first point, it needs to be a place, and I have the right to expect that it's a place where I am able to grow. Go back to 1 Peter 2 again and see what that natural reaction to longing for that spiritual milk was going to be, that ye may grow thereby. With a steady diet comes the expectation of steady growth, right? I mean, don't we understand that in terms of physical nutrition? As we are growing up, as we receive that steady diet of nutrition, we expect that with the steady diet comes steady growth. Now, in our case, a steady diet leads to extraordinary growth. But if we're feeding our children, and we're feeding them right, and they're not growing, what do? Periodically, you take your children to the doctor. And at least if it's their regular checkups, whether it be every few months or now once a year as they get older, when you go for their regular checkup, what do? Well, they measure their height, they measure their weight, and then they compare their height and their weight to all the other children in the country. And you find out what percentile your child falls into, so that you know whether or not your child is growing normally. Word comes back, we measured your child in height and weight. We compared it to all the other children in the country, and they're just not growing at the rate that they should. What do? You go to every single doctor that you have to, right, before you come to a conclusion of what the problem is. And then you go to every doctor that you possibly can until you find a way to fix the problem, right? It's eye-opening to us. It floors us. Our world stops until a solution is found. Physically. But I find it alarming that it's not alarming that an individual can be a member of a local congregation for years and years and years. Maybe the entirety of their lives, they never grow, and we don't even bat an eyelash, and neither do they. If I'm going to expect the local church to be an environment where I'm going to be fed properly, then with that nutrition needs to come the expectation of growth. Now, where does a lot of the responsibility for that growth fall? It falls right there, don't get me wrong. If I'm not growing as a Christian, that doesn't mean I get to lay the entirety of the blame on the local church. It does not, and I don't want anybody to get that mentality. But if I'm not growing properly as a Christian, it might be the case, it's possible that it is the case, that the environment in which I am has not helped. It might be the case that the church environment where I am a member has not contributed to my growth, that it hasn't challenged me to grow, that there's not any accountability for growth, that I'm just allowed to remain in a spiritually childlike state without any other expectation ever offered to me. That all sounds familiar, doesn't it? Hebrews chapter 5, that was exactly what was the case with some of the Christians to whom that book was written. Hebrews chapter 5, beginning in verse 12, the writer expresses the fact that after they had had contact with those people, whoever the writer is and whoever the recipients are, that writer, after having contact with those people, had just naturally expected, as we all should naturally expect, that when we become Christians, that we care enough about our Christianity that we put effort into growing. And he said, I don't see it. I expected you by now to have grown to this extent, but you have not. Look at what he said. For when by reason of the time ye ought to be teachers, that is, you ought to have grown enough mentally, intellectually in your understanding of the Bible. You should have grown enough that you now would be capable of teaching others. He said you haven't. You still have need again that someone teach you the rudiments of the first principles of the oracles of God. And you're not become such, and you are become such as have need of milk and not of strong meat. He's telling them you are at the point in your life, you've had enough time, you've had enough opportunity that you should have grown to the extent that you've gone beyond the need for mere milk, to where now you could ingest and digest spiritual meat. And you could take the strength that you get from that spiritual meat and infuse that into your efforts to teach others. But he said, you have not grown. You are still babies who have to be bottle fed, the milk of the Word, the rudiments of the first principles of the oracles of God. Now, why had they not grown? I have no idea. I don't know if it was completely their fault, if they were in a church environment where they could have grown and they just hadn't taken the initiative to, or what. But the way he writes in Hebrews chapter 5, that sounds like it's a pretty broad, sweeping rebuke, right? He's not just singling out a few people. He's writing those words to whoever he wrote the rest of the epistle to. And that sounds pretty broad sweeping to me, like it might be the case that there were congregations present who, number one, themselves had not grown, and therefore, number two, had not provided spiritual environments that were conducive to those people growing. If I have the expectation to grow, which I should, and God definitely does, and I'm willing to put forth the effort into my personal growth, as a member of a local church, I have the right to expect that local church is a place that's not going to hinder that growth. And that is entirely possible, folks. It is entirely possible to take an individual who wants to grow, stick them in a particular church environment that hinders church growth, and make shipwreck of their faith. I've seen it happen, and you've seen it happen. It's not just, though, about not hindering growth, right? It's about being indifferent about that growth. If a congregation is just not concerned with the growth of itself as a congregation, yes, but if it's not concerned with the growth of each and every single member among it, why do they even exist? Honestly. Do we exist just to be here? If we're not concerned with growing? A church that is not concerned with growth, I'll tell you what it is. It's not a dying church. It's a church that's already dead. As Christians, members of a local church, we have the right to expect that church of which we're members, that church in which we are invested, that it's a place where I can grow, that doesn't just not hinder me and isn't just indifferent about it, but wants me to grow and is trying to empower me to grow and gives me opportunities to grow. Number 3. As a member of a local church, I should expect that church to be a place where I can serve. We talked this morning about Titus chapters 2 and 3 and the emphasis that Titus had, or Paul had in that epistle to Titus, regarding this concept of good works. Titus 2:7, 2:14, chapter 3 verse 8, chapter 3 verse 14. Each of those 4 passages, Paul emphasizes the fact that he wants Titus to emphasize among the Christians that their commitment to good works was absolutely necessary. It wasn't something that was just optional. It wasn't like an extracurricular activity as a Christian. It was something that was vital to their function as children and servants of God. And that wasn't just true in Crete. And it wasn't just true with Titus. You see that same mentality flow throughout so many other passages in the New Testament. As an example, think of Galatians chapter 6. Galatians 6, read verses 1 and 2 and then skip down to verse 10 and tell me that Paul didn't expect those folks in the church of Galatia to be servants. Chapter 6, verse 1, brethren, if a man be overtaken in any trespass, ye who are spiritual do what? Restore such a one in spirit of gentleness, looking to thyself lest thou also be tempted. And in the process, he said, verse 2, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Verse 10, so then as we have opportunity, let us work that which is good toward all men, and especially toward them that are of the household of faith. That wasn't the first time Paul had addressed the need that we as Christians have to serve. Back in chapter 5, verse 13, he said this, for ye, brethren, were called for freedom. Only use not your freedom for an occasion to the flesh, but use it in this way. Through love be servants one to another. Paul wanted those Galatian Christians to know that they had a purpose as Christians, and one of those purposes was to serve, to be active and engaged in the needs of people around them. We mentioned Philippians 1:5 this morning and the fact that the Philippian Christians were joint participants serving Paul in his work to ensure that he was able to do his work. And the Philippian church made sure that was an environment where people could step in and serve in that capacity to make sure that Paul was able to do that. Think of Acts chapter 6. There was such a mentality of service present among those early disciples that when the Grecian widows began to be neglected in the daily ministration, what happened? There was such an uproar among the brethren that the apostles made sure that they took the time to set aside certain men with certain qualifications who could dedicate themselves to serving those needs. And in Acts 20 and verse 34, to those same Ephesian elders, Paul cited the service that those elders had offered to him, using their own hands to minister unto his necessities. In each of those places you see needs that were clearly evident. Needs that not only could they as individual Christians take the initiative to assume in serving, but needs that they as congregations made sure that collectively they put effort toward serving. We talked a minute ago about a church that's not concerned with growth. It's a dead church. Church that's not concerned with serving, ministering to the needs of others. It's a dead church. There are too many examples, too many blatant statements throughout the New Testament of Jesus ministering to the needs of people around Him, teaching His disciples to minister to the needs of people around them. To the early Christians after the kingdom was established, themselves serving the needs of people around them and being taught to serve the needs of the people around them. For us to think that 2,000 years removed, we don't have to do it. The church has the same responsibility in that regard. And I have that same responsibility as a Christian as much as you have that same responsibility as a Christian. And so the church of which we are a part needs to be a church that, number one, understands the need that we as Christians have to serve others, and number two, takes the initiative within ourselves to do what we can in serving others and encourage everybody among us to do the same. Number four, if I'm going to be a member of a local church, I need to be able, and I should be able, I have the right to be able to expect that that local church is going to be a place where I can be led, where I can be shepherded, where I can be directed in a sense, where I can be overseen. There's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that from the earliest days of Christianity, God intended for each local church to be governed by an appointed leadership. Absolutely no doubt whatsoever. It was never God's intention for a church to just drift along leaderless, without any guidance and without any direction. That's where many congregations have come to, but it's never been what God has expected. He always expected His churches to be governed by qualified, appointed individuals. When Paul and his co-workers traveled home after their first missionary journey, in Acts chapter 14, you remember that they did two things, verses 22 and 23. Number one, in verse 22, as they traveled back through Galatia and looped around back to Jerusalem where they had started, we're told in verse 22 that they sought to confirm the souls of all of those disciples that they had taught and been able to convert. After whatever time had passed since they had last been there, they wanted to make sure they were still strong, they were still firm in the faith. But number two, verse 23, what does Luke record that Paul and his co-workers did on that trip back? It says they appointed elders in every city as God had told them to. The earliest days of those congregations, Paul understood that God wanted those churches to be overseen by elders, by leadership. In Titus chapter 1 and verse 5, Paul told Titus that one of his responsibilities as an evangelist on the island of Crete was to do what? Appoint elders, to make sure that those Christians were being led in the way that God intended. Not the way that they resigned themselves to, not in the way that just worked for them, but to be led in the way that God intended for them to be led. And those elders are chosen according to God's qualifications so that they are equipped to do the job that God has given to them, and God instructs them what to do so that they are given the tools necessary to discharge His orders. And while kind of going back to our discussion this morning for just a minute, while those elders should be able to expect our honor, our respect, and our cooperation, 1 Timothy 5 and verse 17, at the same time we, as members under their direction, should be able to expect that they do their jobs well as leaders, as God has instructed them to. Even to such an extent that Paul said later in verse 20 of that same chapter, that when that doesn't happen, when whatever it is comes into play and those leaders aren't leading like they should, he said they need to be reproved in the sight of all, because that simply is not acceptable. And we as members of that local congregation have the right to expect better. Since God saw fit to appoint leaders in local churches, I think it's safe to say that He believed that we needed proper leadership. The direction of the local church is far too important to take this matter lightly. And so we as Christians have the right to expect that we take that seriously, that this congregation, that any congregation, take that matter seriously and discharge that expectation accordingly. As a Christian, I have the right to be able to expect that local church to be a place where I can be overseen, where I can be directed and governed, where I can be led. No doubt there might be some other things that we could have mentioned in this list tonight. There might have been some other things we could have listed among those this morning. I think, anyway, that the four we mentioned this morning, the four that we mentioned tonight, give us a good general reality of number one, what the church should be able to expect of us from this morning, and then number two, tonight, what we should be able to expect of that local church in which we have invested ourselves so very much, that ultimately can influence whether I am saved or whether I'm lost. But you know, these aren't two questions, the one we looked at tonight, the one we looked at this morning. These aren't questions that someone who's not serious about their Christianity are even going to consider. If we're not serious about Christianity, then the local church it's just here. It means nothing to us. But if we are truly serious about our Christianity, if we're truly serious about our relationship with God, about our soul salvation, and what all of this means to us personally, then these are going to be questions that are on our mind. And the reality that these are things that can influence the rest of our lives and influence us on into eternity. But it all, of course, begins with the decision that we make to become Christians, to be members of that church. And if you haven't done that tonight, then we hope that you will. And by faith, repentance, confession, immersion, faithful living, the Bible teaches that we can be redeemed of our sins, added to that kingdom, to that body, and be able to live in hope and anticipation of a great eternity in the presence of God once this life is over. Now, maybe you've done that in the past. You are a member of the local church, so to speak. You are a Christian, but you just haven't lived like it. And you've allowed sin to retake control of your life, and you need to come back. Repentance, confession, and prayer. 1 John chapter 1 tells us that if we'll do that, then He's faithful and just to forgive us of our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Tonight, if you are not a Christian, or you are, and you need to come back and rededicate your life to God and commit yourself to the work of God moving forward throughout life, looking forward to eternity, then please, please, please come tonight, come now, while together we stand and sing.
When we walk with the Lord in the light of His word, what glory sheds on our way, while we do His good will,